Okay, let's kick things off. You know that feeling, right? When you're trying to quickly get a handle on something important, maybe
Yeah,
you see an infographic, something visual, and instead of clearing things up, you're just more confused.
definitely happens. Yeah.
Well, that's kind of what you described when you sent over this infographic about expected oil production for 2025.
Right. It looked like it should give the lay of the land, who's pumping what.
But something just felt well off.
Exactly.
Hmm.
So this deep dive, what we're doing here is taking that specific infographic you saw,
Okay.
holding it up against some reliable data, and figuring out what the actual expected oil production figures look like for key countries in the region for 2025.
Got it. Cut through the noise.
That's the plan. We've got the infographic itself, which you mentioned was attributed to Bloomberg,
Yes.
and we're mainly comparing it to the U.S. Energy Information Administration's short-term energy outlook, the CITIO, specifically the April 2025 one.
Okay, that's a pretty standard, respected source, isn't it?
Oh, absolutely. Very standard. Plus some other industry numbers to fill gaps. And like you said, the differences we found are, well, they're quite surprising.
Surprising might be putting it mildly. So let's jump right in. What was the first thing that made you go, wait a second, when you saw those infographic numbers?
Oh, just the sheer scale of some figures. Instantly. Like, it listed Algeria producing 156.6 million barrels per day.
Hold on. 156.6 million barrels per day.
That just sounds impossible. Isn't global production itself somewhere around 100 million barrels per day?
That just sounds impossible. Isn't global production itself somewhere around 100 million barrels a day?
Exactly. You've hit it right there. Total global oil production, give or take, is about 100 million barrels per day.
So one country producing 156 million.
It's simply not feasible. Not even close. And the Saudi number, 92.3 million, also wildly out of sync with, reality and any credible forecasts.
Right. Okay, so these numbers are obviously wrong. Massively wrong. Any idea how that could happen? Is it just like a typo or something else?
Well, the most probable culprit seems to be a unit error. That's the first guess.
Meaning?
Meaning they might have intended to write 1,000 barrels per day, KBD, instead of million barrels per day, MBD. That's a 1,000-fold difference right there. Or, could just be straight up typos. A misplaced decimal point, an extra digit that can blow numbers up hugely.
Okay, let's test that theory. The unit error one.
Yeah.
If that Algeria number, 156.6 million, was meant to be 1,000 barrels per day, what does that look like?
Okay, so if it were 156.6 thousand barrels per day, that's 156,600 barrels a day. Or 0.1566 million barrels per day.
Right. And how does that compare to the actual expected figure?
Still way off. The EIA data, which we're using as our baseline, projects Algeria at about 1.38 million barrels per day for the first quarter of 2025.
Okay, so 0.15 versus 1.38. Still a huge gap.
Huge gap.
Yeah.
And just to cover bases, what if it was an annual total? 156.6 million barrels over a whole year.
What would that average out to daily?
That works out to roughly 0.43 million barrels per day. So again, still nowhere near the EIA's 1.38 million projection.
So no matter how you slice it, that number's just wrong.
Pretty much, yeah. And it kind of shows how easily things can get confused. Data reporting, aggregation, different groups might measure things slightly differently, or maybe it gets copied wrong somewhere down the line.
Before it even becomes an infographic, right?
Exactly. Leads to major confusion.
Okay, so it really hammers home how wrong that infographic was. Let's get to the real numbers then. Based on the EIA and other reliable sources, what are the anticipated production figures for 2025? Let's start with Algeria again.
Okay, so as we said, EIA's Q1 2025 number, which seems a good proxy for the year for OPEC members, is 1.38 million barrels per day for Algeria.
1.38 million. Got it. What about Saudi Arabia? The infographic had them at over 90 million.
Yeah, the reality, according to that same EIA Q1 2025 data, is 10.68 million barrels per day.
10.68. Okay. Still massive, but, believable.
Absolutely. Then Kuwait expected around 2.75 million barrels per day.
2.75.
Iraq is at 4.41 million barrels per day.
4.41.
And the UAE, they're projected at 4.18 million barrels per day. Again, all these are from that EIA Q1 2025 outlook.
Yeah. And Iran, they were on the infographic too.
Iran, yes. Anticipated level is around 4.76 million barrels per day, also drawing from that Q1 figure.
4.76. Okay. What about some of the non-OPEC countries listed? Oman, Qatar.
Right, so for Oman, which isn't an OPEC, the EIA gives an actual annual average forecast for 2025. That's 1.02 million barrels per day.
1.02 million.
And Qatar, also non-OPEC, projected annual average of 1.88 million barrels per day for 2025.
1.8. And Bahrain. Was Bahrain included?
It was, yeah. The EIA report doesn't break it out in the same detail, but we can estimate using other recent data. Like CEIC data showed their 2023 production was about 0.183 million barrels per day.
So for 2025, probably somewhere around there.
Yeah, a reasonable ballpark figure would be maybe 0.2 million barrels per day. 0.2.
0.2. Wow. Okay, so the difference between these numbers and what was on that infographic it's staggering.
It really is. I mean, it's worth saying again, some of those infographic numbers weren't just off by a bit. They were off by factors of 10, 20, even over 100 times the actual projections.
Incredible.
And the reason we feel comfortable using that Q1 2025 data from the EIA as a guide for the whole year for the OPEC countries is because their production levels looked pretty stable in that first quarter forecast.
Yeah.
No huge swings expected right away.
Right. Now, you mentioned Algeria, and that reminds me of something I've heard sometimes, this idea that maybe Algeria faces some challenges with long-term planning in its oil sector. Does the data reflect that at all?
That's a really relevant point people bring up. And yeah, there are definitely discussions about challenges, things like aging infrastructure, potential economic pressures, and the country's heavy reliance on oil and gas revenue. Maybe, questions about diversification for the long run.
So factors that could make big long-term production increases difficult to plan or achieve.
Exactly. Those are potential long-term headwinds for sure.
Yeah.
But interestingly, despite those background concerns, the EIA forecast for Q1 2025, showing that steady 1.38 million barrels per day.
Yeah.
It suggests that, at least in the near term, their output is expected to hold steady.
Yeah.
So the immediate forecast looks stable, even if those longer-term planning questions are valid.
Huh. That's a good distinction. Near-term stability versus longer-term questions. Are there any other sort of nuances or upcoming things that might shift these 2025 numbers slightly?
Yeah, a couple of things worth noting. First, Saudi Arabia. There have been OPEC plus announcements suggesting they might increase production capacity, potentially adding about 1 million barrels per day by December 2025.
Okay, so later in the year.
Right. If that happens, it could nudge their annual average up a bit from that 10.68 Q1 figure we mentioned.
Makes sense.
Also, OPEC plus as a whole has made some recent policy tweaks. They announced a collective production increase planned to start in May 2025.
How much?
It was about 411,000 barrels per day spread across the relevant members.
Okay, so 400,000 barrels. Oh, that's not insignificant, but...
But it's nowhere near large enough to explain the kind of crazy numbers we saw in that infographic. Not even remotely. It's a relatively minor adjustment in the grand scheme of things.
Right. And I guess stepping back, looking at the big picture, if you just added up all the numbers on the infographic...
Oh, yeah. If you did that math...
It wouldn't make any sense globally, would it?
Not at all. The total implied production from that infographic would be vastly higher than the entire planet's demand for oil.
Right.
And also way beyond the world's total capacity to even produce that much oil. So just that simple check tells you the infographic is fundamentally flawed.
Okay. So let's sort of wrap this part up. The main takeaway is that infographic you sent over, the one showing expected 2025 oil production, it contains some really significant errors, wildly inaccurate figures.
Absolutely. The numbers for key countries were just dramatically inflated, completely out of line with credible data.
And the more reliable sources, like the EIA we've been discussing, point to much, much lower production levels that actually seem, plausible.
That's the picture, yes.
Yeah.
Using those authoritative sources, like the EIA's outlook, is really essential if you want an accurate view of the energy landscape, for understanding, for decision-making, anything.
It really underscores, doesn't it, how important it is to check your sources, to be critical of data you see, especially when it's presented visually like that.
For sure. Data literacy is key.
So maybe a final thought here for you, the listener, to mull over. What are the implications when you see data discrepancies this big? What could be the reasons, intentional or just mistakes, behind such wrong reporting?
Good question.
And maybe more practically, in this world, just swimming in data, what steps can we all take, personally or maybe in our organizations, to make sure we're actually working with information we can trust, especially in areas that matter to us?
Definitely something worth thinking about further. How do we ensure data integrity?
Exactly. How do we navigate that? Something to explore.